No, don't mimic successful founders because they cannot show you how to solve the biggest challenge in entrepreneurship. The motto of Y Combinator is to, quote, make something people want. This advice for founders is about as useful as telling an aerospace engineer that for an airplane to fly, it just needs to get in the air and stay there. Planes fly by generating lift, and aerospace engineers know how that works. Similarly, startups need to get customers, but the challenge remains how. How can founders know if they are about to make something people want? If their startup might get customers, if they have a good startup idea? What's ironic to me is that many entrepreneurs try to overcome this challenge by seeking advice from the most successful founders. The catch is that the best founders have an intuition for good startup ideas, but they don't know how it works. For instance, Paul Graham, the founder of YC, says that he has, quote, an internal compass for good startup ideas, but he can't explain how it works. For the rest of us, instinct is not enough. Founders who use a gut feel approach to choose which startup idea to work on usually waste a year or more before recognizing that they are not building something that people want. I know this personally. Hi, I'm Mike, and I believe that the biggest challenge in entrepreneurship today is that founders have no way to know if they are about to make something that people want. In this episode, I want to explain who I am and why I created Nascent as the solution to this challenge. Nascent is a measurement system that allows founders of startups with no customers to estimate revenue next year by analyzing conversations. Specifically, Nascent allows founders to identify the people who might become the startup's first customers and to quantify in dollars how much those people might pay. This metric does for startups what the metric of lift does for airplanes. It enables founders to quickly weed out bad ideas so that they can focus on opportunities. Welcome to the Nascent Podcast. I'm Mike Vladimir, and I'm obsessed with startups with no customers. The word nascent means just coming into existence and beginning to display signs of future potential. And I've created this strategy called Nascent as a way for you to determine whether those signs reveal an opportunity or a distraction. This is episode 23. No, don't mimic successful founders. Instead, meet the guy solving startups' biggest challenge. So who am I, what have I done, and why am I the right person to solve the biggest challenge in entrepreneurship? Specifically, today, founders have no way to know if they're about to, quote unquote, make something people want. So they often waste a year building a startup before recognizing that it will not meaningfully get customers. Nascent allows founders to identify the people who might become the startup's first customers and to quantify how much those people might pay. This results in an ERNY value spelled ERNY, which stands for estimated revenue next year for your startup in dollars before you even try to get a customer. I'll give you 3 reasons why I can do this. First is my background in quantification. For years, I worked characterizing electronics products that had never been measured before. And do you know what else has never been measured before? Startups with no customers. The second reason is my penchant for crossing boundaries. Nascent's quantification framework uses many concepts that are outside of conventional entrepreneurship. Third is that my superpower is explaining things, and I have decades of experience specifically focusing on startups with no customers. But I consider that to be table stakes since there are lots of experienced entrepreneurs who are good communicators. So measurement systems, crossing borders, and table stakes. That is what it's going to take to solve the biggest challenge in entrepreneurship. And most importantly, I am obsessed with this specific challenge. There are lots of founders and investors and teachers with experience answering the question, how can we make a startup grow? But that is a different challenge from the question that I'm focused on. I'm asking, is it even worth it in the first place to try to grow the startup? Everyone I have ever met kind of shrugs off this challenge and basically says, yeah, it's too bad that founders waste years building startups that never grow. Oh, well, not me. I am the guy saying that we must solve this, and I have been laser focused on this specific challenge for over a decade. So let's get into my background. I want to share with you the details of my 3 reasons that I'm the guy to build Nascent, starting with table stakes and then diving into measurement systems and crossing boundaries. For 10 years, I worked in Silicon Valley, the center of the world for entrepreneurship. I've been in startups more broadly for 20 years. As a founder, I've created about 10 startups, and many of those projects lasted for years. I like to say that most startups fail, and mine haven't been special. But what is special about me is that I can explain why my startups failed and how you can avoid a similar waste of time by using Nascent. I've also worked at other people's startups and in corporate innovation labs, which are basically startups within large enterprises. 3 words describe how I work: create, collaborate, and communicate. To me, create means searching for opportunities to create new businesses, running discovery interviews, and building simple prototypes to determine the likelihood of a project's success. Collaborate basically means helping other founders do the same thing, helping them create. I got my MBA at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, where I spent most of my time in the Entrepreneurship Center. So after I graduated, I really wanted to give back to my community. So I've been mentoring other founders through Haas and through other entrepreneurial support organizations. And those experiences are what led me to create the frameworks that have become Nascent. So that's create and collaborate. Now let's get into communicate. For me, communicate means explaining things in a way that makes sense to any audience. I've been a teacher and a communicator my whole life. In high school, I ran science class for 5th graders. As an undergraduate at Tufts University and then at graduate school at Carnegie Mellon, I was a teaching assistant. Understanding complex systems and simplifying them for different audiences has been a cornerstone of my professional life. Probably my favorite example of this is when I explained microchip fabrication to my grandmother using a metaphor about putting icing and fondant on a cake. I would call this my superpower, at least in one-on-one conversations. This is harder to do in group settings, especially through a podcast, because larger audiences mean that it's harder for me to tailor my message to each audience. So if anything doesn't make sense to you, no worries, just let me know and I'll do my best to address it. On that note, I've already gotten really useful feedback from Oren Tuchin, Gal Vered, and Mary McKee. Thanks to them. So as you join me on this journey, you should expect lots of simplifications and metaphors. I see this as table stakes for my legitimacy to talk about startups with you. Now let's get into some of my unique experiences outside of startups that set me up to create Nascent. In college, I studied electrical engineering, and then I got my first job in an engineering research lab. That's when I realized that a good engineer can put their head down and just work on a problem without talking to anybody for like a week straight. But I like people too much, and I like communicating, so I needed something more interactive. And that's what led me to my next job, which was creating measurement systems for the government, taking messy qualitative things and turning them into specific quantitative standards. And because it was a government job, that meant that I had to explain my work publicly. This experience was foundational to me creating Nascent. Specifically, I worked as a regulator, creating energy efficiency regulations for the US Department of Energy and their counterpart in Canada called Natural Resources Canada. Here's how government regulations work. Consumers buy products at a store, like let's say you go to buy a fridge at a Costco. What you don't know is that Costco cannot just sell you whatever fridge they want. If they could, they might sell you a really cheap fridge for like $10 that has no insulation. And at first you would think that you're getting this great deal until you bring it home and plug it in, and after a month you get this huge energy bill for like thousands of dollars. This would be bad for you, the consumer, because you would have bought something that you thought was cheap but is actually painfully expensive over time. And it would be really bad for the country because we'd build tons of power plants. This would just be a big mess. Regulations fix this problem by finding the right balance between what you pay at the store and what you pay on your electricity bill. Personally, I worked on regulations for electronics products, like the power supply that's powering your laptop and your phone right now. I also worked on Christmas lights and television sets. For each product, I needed to create a test procedure and a regulatory standard. First, I had to figure out, how are we going to measure this thing? And then I had to figure out where the cutoff should be, where the government should say that this product wastes so much energy that it's going to be illegal. Characterizing these complex systems was the most challenging and most important aspect of my job. Going from the messy, unstructured world of products and consumers to a quantitative specification that a product designer could actually meet. So when you think about me, please know that I'm super passionate and deeply experienced both with simplifying communications and with simplifying complex systems. For me, regulations were really interesting, but they lacked impact. My work probably saved you a few dollars of electricity, which you will never notice. And that's what led me to get my MBA at Berkeley with a focus on entrepreneurship. To me, startups are a way to benefit people much more tangibly. The best example I can give was when I was an intern at Waze. Before the Google acquisition, Waze had a small office in Palo Alto, California, with the word Waze painted huge on the front. I was regularly blown away when people walking by would open the door and say, "Is this Waze, like the navigation app on my phone, Waze? You guys are awesome!" At Berkeley, I hope to build a startup like Waze. All of my class projects focused on my startup called Yago, as in Yay, Go! By far, the best class I took at Berkeley was Lean Launchpad with Steve Blank and Jerry Engel. If you're not familiar with them, Steve created the concept of customer discovery and then coined the term get out of the building, meaning go figure out what customers really want, not what you think they want. Steve and Jerry went on to create the Innovation Core, the I-Core, as part of the National Science Foundation. In their class, I ran customer discovery interviews, I iterated a business model canvas, and I kept hitting one challenge that they could not help me overcome. I said, "I want to create a unicorn!" And they told me, "Your idea sucks." And I kept asking, why? Why does my idea suck? How do you know? How can I identify a good idea? And I could never get a satisfying answer to my question. And because they couldn't explain to me why my idea sucked, I didn't trust their assessment. Let's be clear, they were right. I was totally wasting my time. It just took me forever to see it. And my team and I, we did everything quote unquote right, We ran our standard 100 interviews, but I never had a way to bridge the gap, to go from those 100 conversations to actually understanding why Yago sucked, why it was such a bad startup idea. That was 13 years ago, and I've launched a bunch of startups since then, but I have never let go of this challenge. Nascent is the tool that I wish I would have had back then. The ability to quantify those interviews in dollars would have immediately clarified for me why Yago was not worth building. And I would have reached that result with far fewer interviews much more quickly. So if you're a founder trying to decide whether you've got a good startup idea, yes, you should run a bunch of interviews, but that is not enough to be decisive. And yes, you should leverage resources like the book The Mom Test so that you ask the right questions, but that's still not enough to be decisive. Ultimately, you need a way to process the data from the interviews to be able to come to a decision about whether your startup idea is a distraction or an opportunity. As far as I can tell, Nascent is the only strategy specifically tackling this challenge. Since graduating from Berkeley, I've mentored 100 founders and helped them understand why they were struggling and how they could navigate their challenges. In my mentoring sessions, founders would often come to me with a burning problem, and I would try to help them break down the problem and identify an actionable next step. I probably hit that goal 70% of the time. These sessions became the foundation of my consulting practice. And meeting by meeting, brick by brick, that's what led me to build Nascent. I've also read a bunch of books about entrepreneurship, I've listened to a ton of podcasts, and I've watched countless videos. It took me a really long time to notice that almost all of the advice for founders of startups with no customers basically comes down to, you know it when you see it. In episode 20, I talked about how I'm a huge fan of the cooking instructor Helen Rennie because she rejects the touch and feel approach of celebrity chefs. Instead, Helen insists on specific steps and precise measurements. My work in regulations has given me a visceral reaction to instructors who tell you that you'll know it when you see it. To somebody who's inexperienced, that advice seems helpful until they try it and they get burned. What's worse is that the cooks in the kitchen and the founders of startups will often blame themselves when you know it when you see it inevitably fails. As a regulator, I learned that instructions must be specific and repeatable. Otherwise, you're just going to have garbage in, garbage out. In the words of one of my heroes, Richard Feynman, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. It only makes sense to me in retrospect, but my path from simplifying complex systems as a government regulator to being a startup founder overwhelmed by the complexities of entrepreneurship has been foundational to Nascent. One big advantage that I had as a regulator of electronics products was that at least the problem space was defined. At least I was only dealing with electrons that I could measure in volts and amps using a multimeter. Entrepreneurship is even more complex and more unstructured. It's not clear what to measure, let alone how to measure it. This is where my unique experiences crossing boundaries also becomes foundational to Nascent. This is harder for me to articulate, but I've definitely noticed a theme in my life that I'm attracted to the boundaries of things, to crossing borders. I grew up in New Jersey near the shore, and I love the spot where water meets the land. As an undergraduate at Tufts University, I was fascinated by how everything is hidden in electrical engineering, as opposed to other fields like mechanical engineering, which is more visible, more tangible. For instance, torque, twisting force, that's tangible. You encounter torque every time you turn a knob on a door. By contrast, voltage is hidden. Voltage refers to how much an electron wants to move. Nobody is ever going to see or touch a volt of electricity. So I had to think in metaphors like the electron feeling an urge to move, even though electrons don't have wants or feelings. My master's thesis focused on microchips that transform one kind of energy into another, again, crossing borders. Of all the places to get my first job, I chose an engineering lab in Spain so that I could become fluent. I really wanted to be able to move between the English-speaking world and the Spanish-speaking world. My experiences moving across boundaries are what enabled me to make complex hidden phenomena relatable to people's everyday experiences, like drawing that parallel between the electron wanting to move and the doorknob wanting to spring back in place after you turn it. Or using metaphors to show you as a founder how you can identify a person in pain and quantify the price that they might pay for your startup's product. Previously on the Nascent podcast, in episode 21 and episode 22, I began to articulate that founders of startups with no customers should not try to get customers because that's too tedious, it's too time-consuming. Instead, I want you to get an earlier signal by searching for people in pain. Of course, there's a catch. People in pain are invisible. Similar to measuring invisible electrons, Nascent is a strategy for measuring invisible people in pain. To do this, Nascent involves crossing lots of boundaries, which we'll discuss over the coming episodes. Here's a preview. We're going to search like a wildcatter, prospecting for oil. We're going to characterize people like a nurse dealing with a patient who can't even speak. And we're going to use behavioral economics to predict how much a customer might pay for a product. By pulling these concepts together and applying them to entrepreneurship, we'll have a strategy to identify people who could become our startup's first customers. This probably sounds like a lot, but each piece on its own is actually pretty simple, which is why I think they make for good podcast episodes. And then we're going to connect all of these disparate concepts, and that will culminate in Nascent's repeatable measurement system, the ERNIE value, which stands for estimated revenue next year for your startup before you even try to get a customer. If you want to quote unquote make something people want, then I want you to have a strategy for your startup with no customers that is dramatically better than the status quo. The conventional approach is you know a good startup idea when you see it. That is not a strategy. My circuitous journey, starting from a random engineering job, going to a unsexy government job, and then working on the biggest problem in entrepreneurship, reminds me of a funny conversation I had at a San Francisco tech conference. At the time, Amazon had just released Alexa, and it was this amazing new technology that everybody was buzzing about. And so I'm at the conference and I meet this guy who's actually on the Alexa team. And I have to say to him, dude, how did you get this job? It must have been so competitive. And he goes, oh no, Amazon, they recruited me. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he goes, oh, so you know how when you call a customer service helpline and you get this phone tree that says dial 1 for sales, dial 2 for marketing, and then they changed it to if you want sales, say sales. If you want marketing, say marketing. And I'm like, yeah, of course, I hate those. And the guy goes, yeah, exactly. Everybody hates those. So I was working at this company that makes those audio phone trees. And that is what made Amazon reach out to me for the job on the Alexa team. So I don't know, but I would love if a similar twist of fate might happen to take me from previously mundane jobs to something really exciting with Nascent. We'll see what happens. But it really does feel to me like my career path from engineering through government regulations to getting my MBA and working on startups, all the while teaching people and moving across these boundaries, it feels like this is culminating in a breakthrough solution. And I really hope that Nascent is a meaningful advancement against the biggest challenge in entrepreneurship, because I cannot stand so many founders wasting so much time on bad ideas. I am dying to change that. So if you know a founder of a startup with no customers who wants a better strategy, please send them this episode. And if you're a founder of a funded startup that's pivoting into a new idea that has no customers right now, let's get on a call. You can schedule a time with me using nascentidea.com. As always, I welcome your feedback. You can email me at podcast@nascentidea.com or tweet me using @nascentidea. And please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps. Thanks so much to the listeners who've provided feedback, starting with Claudia. I've been saying that, as far as I know, I'm the only person tackling this challenge. And honestly, that makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm trying to prove a negative. So I felt really excited when Claudia wrote me. She said, quote, I think I'm one of the people that is working on the problem that you're working on, but a conversation would help determine that, end quote. So Claudia and I had our conversation, and it turns out that Claudia's focus is actually downstream of Nascent, so our work is complementary. So as far as I know, I am still the only person working on the biggest challenge in startups, and I've given you 3 reasons why I am the right guy to do it. First, table stakes, my deep experience in startups with no customers and my ability to teach. Second, measurement systems, my years spent quantifying consumer electronics products. And third, crossing borders, my penchant for combining ideas from different fields. My unique background, table stakes, measurement systems, and crossing borders, this is what has allowed me to create Nascent, the strategy for startups with no customers. And I can't wait to share it with you so that you can identify an opportunity worth pursuing. Okay, founders, let's do this.